Welcome to this episode of We the People, a Bradley Speaker Series. I'm Rick Graber, president of the Bradley Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us. The Heritage Foundation has long been a reservoir of thought leadership and world-class policy research on the right, with progressive ideology now controlling almost every major American institution and the future of conservatism at a crossroads. Heritage has its work cut out for it. But their new leader is no stranger to shaking things up, and he's now clearly ready for this challenge. Kevin Roberts is the seventh president in Heritage's 48-year history. Previously, he served as CEO of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, or TPPF, an Austin-based nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute and the largest state think tank in the nation. During Kevin's tenure at TPPF, the organization more than doubled in size. Prior to that, he served as president of Wyoming Catholic College. Under Kevin's leadership, the college adopted a policy of refusing to accept federal student loans and grants, and that sure sounds like a great idea. A lifelong educator, he earned his PhD in American history from the University of Texas. Welcome, Kevin. Thanks for being with us.
Well, Rick, thanks for having me. I, of course, have loved getting to know you and everyone at Bradley over the last several years, and it's just a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks so much. Kevin, you came out of the gate in your new role with a really interesting piece in National Review on the future of conservatism and Heritage's role in the movement. And in many ways, it does seem like we're at an inflection point. But in your essay, you said that if history is any guide, then we have every reason to believe that the golden age of American conservatism will soon emerge. Why do you believe that?
Well, I believe it for two reasons. The first is, as you mentioned, I'm a historian and a historian of America. And what several episodes in American history point out, that is, Rick, those episodes where it seemed as if everything was lost, that we had our backs in the corner, maybe because of external threats, but as we know, unfortunately, sometimes because of internal threats, we were able to rise to the occasion. And we were able to do that, not just because important leaders, sometimes certain presidents, really reflected the demand of the age. And by the way, I would say as a historian, and make this nonpartisan, great leaders of both parties. I mean, that's something that we need to remember as part of our tradition. But the point is, they reflect the will of the American people, which I believe is very misunderstood and probably underappreciated by the media, which I think spends a lot of time condescending us as Americans, or being condescending toward us. But the second reason is, I believe that even though much has changed about America and American society, that core belief by Americans of all backgrounds, political backgrounds, ethnic, religious backgrounds, is still focused on the future being brighter than the past. Now, some recent polling data would suggest that if we don't turn the corner soon, that we're going to be in sort of a bad spot. But there was a poll that came out earlier this week that suggests Americans are starting to become optimistic again. The point about conservatives in the movement is our movement is forward-looking. It's cheerful. It is bright about the future. There are some things that require some candor from us. But if we can harness, for example, the optimism of Ronald Reagan, while also being really focused on a very specific policy agenda, I'm also confident that there are some great policy innovations being introduced, not just by Heritage, but by what I call the conservative ecosystem. Bradley, obviously, is one of the great facilitators of those ideas. And probably what you're hearing from me, Rick, to sum up, is that I'm an optimist in my nature. And I just think that almost always America is going to win, even in some of these internal episodes of turmoil that we're obviously in the middle of right now.
Couldn't agree more. And let's drill down on that a little bit more. Part of the disarray on the right seems to stem from the emergence of nationalist and populist strains that I guess historically have not been part of the movement. How do conservatives, as I think you put it directly, absorb, accommodate, and channel those forces?
Well, look, I think you're right. Historically, just looking at the intellectual history of the conservative movement, which is fascinating. I mentioned to my left of center friends, most of whom I met in graduate school at the University of Texas, that should be a fascinating story even for them because it's a story about America. But the point is, the way we go about absorbing them, assimilating the best of their ideas, is to do something that isn't happening enough right now. And that's have conversations.
Yes.
whether they be virtual conversations like this or in-person conversations when we can back to that. Let's have fewer of those conversations on Twitter, because Twitter brings out the worst nature in all of us, myself included. And so I was writing a talk that I'll be giving here in the next month at an institution we all love. And I say, look, there's a place for Twitter. You got to wage a little battle sometimes. But as conservatives, let's spend more time training our fire, if in fact we are going to train some fire, on the radical left and less on ourselves. And that is a role, as I know you are aware of, that Heritage has always played. That is, we're an all of the above institution. My predecessor and mentor, Dr. Ed Fulner, personifies, present tense, that fusionism of conservatism. If we can acknowledge the frustration that a lot of conservatives, some of them associated with the political world of President Trump, for whom we're grateful, some of them associated with a very opposite strain, and say, we acknowledge that you've got a lot to offer. Let's talk to one another, and then let's develop a positive agenda moving forward. I'm really hopeful that we're going to get there.
And to that point, there's so many things that we can agree on.
That's right.
Wherever you come down as a conservative, and maybe we ought to be a little bit more focused on those things.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Let's switch a little bit and talk about Heritage specifically. You have very conservative credentials. There's no question about that. But I guess in some ways you were an unconventional choice to lead the organization. Heritage has always been at the center of policy debates, but it's been in Washington, D.C. And you don't have extensive Washington, D.C. experience. What made you want to take on this role, and how do you think your background will help shape your plans for Heritage?
Well, thanks for that question. I agree with all of that. I am and hope to remain for the rest of my life a DC outsider. Look, there are great people who do wonderful work inside DC. So I always tell them, I'm not denigrating your work or the fact that you love living in the district. But my board asked me, the Heritage Board said, how do we prevent you from becoming a swamp creature? And I said, if I ever become a swamp creature, I'll have two problems. I'll be without a job because you need to fire me. And I'll also be without a wife, because there's no way Michelle Roberts would want to be married to a swamp creature. But all of that to say, it is a little out of the box for Heritage. And the way that, just short version of that story is, I decided to apply for the position at their invitation, thinking I wouldn't get the job because I thought it kind of needed to go to someone who knows DC well. And I said, but as a member of the extended family of Heritage, I want to give you some constructive criticism, some candor, but within the spirit of charity, about some things you can do better. And the number one thing is for Heritage to spend more time in partnership with state-based organizations. We are not looking to replace them, Rick. I would be the last person, as you might imagine, who would suggest that. But as I've told so many of my friends in the movement who are running state-based or local-based organizations, I want Heritage to be seen as being of service to them. If they've got a big priority, say, for example, universal school choice in Texas, I've been busy this afternoon working with some Texas friends on that. Heritage is going to play a big role. We're investing a lot of resources in that. But the point is, on say, examples like healthcare, some other policy areas, say entitlement reform, there becomes a point where great state-based innovation requires federal action. Let the mothership of the movement then take the ball and score the touchdown. And my thought is that, being an outsider, being very skeptical of the centralized power that exists in the nation's capital, it actually fits perfectly with Heritage's conservatism. And I really want to put in context all of that, surrounded by a very cheerful conservatism, just an optimism that working together, acknowledging our differences of opinion, but also acknowledging they're not the end of the world, that we're going to restore this country to its best days ever.
That's terrific. And as you know better than anyone, there's a tremendous amount of talent in those think tanks out in the States.
There sure is.
And working in partnership and collaboration just makes a whole lot of sense.
That's right. And given the work that you do, and I don't mean this in any sort of fundraising salesmanship, I know from many donor friends that they're looking to make sure that we're all being very good about being stewards of resources. And that comes from collaboration. Heritage doesn't have all the answers. We're going to be able to set a very ambitious federal agenda for the next friendly administration because of what we learned from our state-based partners.
Yes. I know that Heritage has taken on some new initiatives, such as filing its first ever lawsuit, which challenged the government's vaccine mandate on businesses with at least 100 workers. Why did you decide at this time to file a lawsuit, and will we see more of this in the future?
Well, to answer the second question, yes, absolutely. And the reason that I did, and great credit to my predecessor and friend Kay James, because it was before I was even officially on post, Rick, that I went to Kay and the executive committee of our board, and I said, look, you got a problem, and that is your new president will never comply with that vaccine mandate. I didn't comply with the idiocy of Obamacare when I was president of Wyoming Catholic College. I didn't comply with the nonsense of federal student loans and grants, that is to say, the strings attached. I'm not complying with something that's unjust. And the injustice of it is it violates that sacrosanct relationship between employer and employee. And we're going to take a stand. And so on the substance of it, we needed to do it. But let me be really clear. Heritage had never done that. I wasn't aware of that. And so I was opening a bit of a can of worms, but to everyone's credit, Kay's credit, our board's credit, my good friend John Malcolm's credit, and the Me Center here, they all understood that if in fact Heritage is the battleship of the conservative movement, it needs to be on offense every single day. And unfortunately, that means filing some lawsuits, but we're going to do that until we take back this country.
Fantastic. It's great to hear. Last question, Kevin. You're at the front end of this job. What do you think success at Heritage will look like for you?
Well, that's a great question. You know, with my senior management colleagues here, with colleagues generally, I go through this exercise where I go out a year and say it's New Year's Eve 22 or New Year's Eve 2025 or 10 years out. And what's success, folks, if we look back in that year? I'm going to say, give you a 5-year horizon. It isn't just that elections are the only important thing. And I'm not going to be partisan in my response here because I care far more deeply about conservative policy. Whichever party wants to adopt them is fine with me. But that we will see some real significant progress at the state level on things like universal school choice. We will see significant progress that some of the wonderful state-based reforms in healthcare, like what TPPF pioneered in Texas this last year, that Heritage has become sort of the foster parent for at the federal level. The third thing is that Heritage is actually, in addition to all of the work that it's doing internationally, at the federal level, at the state level, is literally investing in the movement by offering some prizes in conservative policy innovation. And so that people see us not just as this big behemoth institution you might work with, you might have to work around. We want to be of service. And so the single greatest metric of success would be that if 5 years out, we do a poll or we do a branding exercise and people inside the movement say, Heritage has been on offense every day. They've gone to battle for us. They have been our brother when we've had a tough time with a certain policy. And then the second thing is, and I know this is close to the heart of all of us as conservatives, that we've broadened our audience, that those parents in Loudoun County, those parents in South Lake Carroll, Texas, who are apolitical, but who are joining the fray as grassroots activists, understand that the immutable principles that we all cherish mean that they need to be part of our movement permanently.
Kevin Roberts, thanks so much for your time today, and thanks for taking on this leadership role at Heritage and in our movement. It's such an important time, and we deeply appreciate it.
Well, it's a great privilege, a great joy, and of course, Rick, thanks for everything that you and your colleagues at Bradley do.
And as always, thanks to all of you for joining us on this episode of We the People.